I'm really interested in what I'm going to call the comedy to drama pipeline because it seems to be the subgenre of prestige television that the most good shows have come out of. It's interesting to me because at first glance this shouldn't be the case. On paper, these kinds of shows shouldn't work at all. Traditionally, a TV dinner sitcom implies a status quo that needs to be maintained. If it deviates too far from what the series originally promised, it stops being the thing you came for. The friends can't be friends anymore if Ross murders his pet monkey. But in the case of a more serialized drama, we expect metamorphosis. Without change, there are no consequences. Everything becomes weightless and the audience has no reason to be invested. These things are at odds with one another, so creating a comedic drama, or if you're a liberal arts major, a dramedy, seems kind of counterintuitive. Some jokes can't exist in a vacuum, but not when telling them is one of the expressed purposes of the series and you have a tone to maintain. And that maintenance is arguably the thing that makes or breaks all shows in this vein. I actually don't know how well known this is, but Breaking Bad was originally pitched as a comedy. Obviously a pretty fucked up one, but a comedy nonetheless. And you can definitely tell the foundation is there, especially throughout the first season.
Get off the toilet! Get off the toilet!
It's why a lot of these episodes read like classic sitcom scenarios. For example, Walt and Jesse have to cook meth, but an open house is scheduled at the same time as their cook. Tune in next week to find out how these crazy cats are going to get out of this wacky situation. But eventually the showrunners realized what worked for the series, so a shift towards a more dramatic tone was made to suit the story that they wanted to tell. I bring this up because Barry has the same sort of deceptively simple sitcom premise. A down-on-his-luck hitman suddenly has an identity crisis and decides he wants to become an actor. Alright, so maybe it's not that simple, but funny, right? And it is. The show is great, but I probably wouldn't be making a video on it if its latest season was more conventional and stuck to the blueprint that the previous two had laid out for it. Because I've seen shows that have masterfully tread the line between comedy and drama, and I've seen shows that have completely lost sight of what those two things even mean. But season 3 of Barry is interesting to me because it almost completely, yet very intentionally, gives up on being a comedy. Alright, so that's not exactly true, but I couldn't help but take the first step into becoming a real content creator by blatantly lying to my audience. Of course, there are still comedic moments in the show. Barry is still hilarious when it wants to be, but most of the comedy this season is less ha-ha funny and more, oh my god, I don't know how else I'm supposed to react to this funny. The introduction of a more bleak outlook also isn't as sudden as I made it out to be. It's still somewhat jarring, but the creators have done a pretty good job at easing the audience down the more morose path that the series is taking. This time around, they clearly wanted to experiment by taking these characters to some dark places, and I'm talking dark with a capital. If they weren't already at rock bottom by episode 1, chances are they'll be dragged there by the finale, so as you can imagine, this doesn't really leave a lot of room for knee-slapping bangers. The show is fundamentally different now, so much so that only half of that elevator pitch premise is still true. In this way, much like the character of Barry, the series suffers from an identity crisis. It's much less of a problem than you'd think, but a problem nonetheless. In fact, pretty much all of the criticisms I have of Barry can be summed up as these kinds of mushy banana problems. It's technically fine, but that doesn't change the fact that I might get violent if I find out that it's in the same area code as me. In this way, it's an incredibly airtight series, but these little issues, they gnaw at the back of my mind while I'm watching, and I'd be lying if I said this doesn't kind of take away from the experience. But to get more into that, I think we kind of have to talk about Barry, the character. Titular character Barry. If the series is about anything, it's about what it means to be a good person and how much this can be challenged before you become completely irredeemable. This idea is what makes Barry, Barry. It's the best part of the show, and completely coincidentally, it's also what the show is willing to expand upon the most. Morality is the name of the game here, and Barry is constantly being tested in terms of how far he'll go in the name of self-preservation. In fact, Barry's selfishness is probably the one thing you can point at as being the character's biggest flaw, besides a refusal to seek therapy. Mental illness off the charts, dog. It's crazy. Anyway, a refusal to take responsibility for his actions is ultimately the only obstacle Barry has on his quest to leave his hitman past behind him. This is all coupled with the fact that he has a fundamental misunderstanding of how his actions hurt those he's closest to. The season practically opens by addressing this very thing. When it begins, all of his surface level problems are pretty much solved. He's not implicated in any of his past crimes, he's seemingly home free, but this hasn't stopped him from spiraling into a deep depression caused by guilt and the emotional rejection of one of the two people he values more than anyone anyone or anything else. Barry has effectively ruined any goodwill between him and pretty much everyone in his life and is willing to do anything to mend these relationships, but he's too self-deluded to realize that his actions have already done irreparable damage. He just wants to be happy. He just wants those he loves to be happy. He wants to be forgiven. In the first 2 seasons, we know that he's a murderer, but we still empathize with him because he's actively trying to be a better person. That's simply not the case here. He revels in his misery because he feels he doesn't have a purpose. Again, he wants to be forgiven, but that's not gonna happen. That's not the kind of show this is. After all, forgiveness has to be earned.
Then fucking earn it!
If the series is about anything, it's about keeping up appearances, and I mean this both in terms of the narrative and the meta-narrative. I already touched on the parallel that can be drawn between the comedy and the drama that the script calls for, but this also goes for the split life that Barry is living and how the show presents itself reflects this. Compared to the first 2 seasons, pretty much any and all vibrancy has been wrung out of its color palette. Obviously, this is a very intentional choice, very deliberate, as is the direction of these episodes. The use of long takes with minimal cutting means that the weight of the show is now put on the performances more than anything else. After all, it's a show about acting and everyone does a phenomenal job with what they're given. When you start the series, you probably aren't expecting the fucking Fonz to turn in the performance of his career, but that's where you'd be wrong. The show's a little quirky like that. Said quirkiness is also felt when the show decides to let loose with a big action scene. The way the cinematographers and the editors are able to bounce off of one another makes it that much more visceral, that much more impactful. It all adds to the experience because the focus is on the emotion behind the scene rather than the action itself. The fact that it's actually good is just the cherry on top. And I know a lot of what I just said may seem obvious, but it clearly isn't to most filmmakers considering this is still the exception in a sea of shaky cam and fence climbing. It's absolutely necessary that everything on the surface is this easily digestible because the more complex character work is really what's going to keep your attention. If the series is about anything, it's about critiquing the toxic traits that are traditionally assigned to gender roles. Okay, so hold on. Before all of your eyes take a gingerly stroll to the back of your skull, I promise you I'll try not to make this one of those, but there is an issue with how Barry portrays gender roles. I'm just not sure I'm smart enough to put my finger on what exactly it is. And that's okay. Life is all about owning up to your shortcomings. I'm sure you have a fair few yourself considering you're currently watching this video. But I've decided to immerse myself fully, so in true straight white male fashion, I've concluded that I don't care and that I'm going to continue to talk about this topic that I'm incredibly ill-equipped to speak on. Gender can be a tricky thing to navigate, but lucky for me, the discussion of how these ideas come across in Barry mostly revolves around the spooky, scary concept of toxic masculinity and the effect this can have on relationships. Sally, one of the leads of the series, is a victim of domestic abuse who promised herself that she would never date a violent man again. The irony of this, of course, being is that she's doing exactly that. And I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about this character who is kind of defined by abuse and toxicity. On one hand, my immediate gut feeling is to not like this. It just feels gross. It's mushy banana all the way down. On the other hand, however, I know that the writers, many of whom are women, are smarter than this because if the series is about anything, it's about how you shouldn't let your past trauma define you, and this is an idea that applies not only to Sally, but to Barry, Kusino, and even Hank. I feel that all of these are fleshed out characters, but they're at their most interesting when they are servicing and directly interacting with Barry. The purpose of Sally's subplot this time around was mostly just to critique the big bad showbiz industry, and it's all fine, but I can't help but feel like her character was kind of sidelined to make room for the bigger fish that this season had to fry. And I understand that's kind of the point. The men dominate the space as a commentary on how these relationships often work. In this way, Barry most reminds me of something like Catherine, where the negative characteristics that are typically assigned to a sex are exaggerated to the nth degree to make some sort of statement. In Barry's case, I just wish this was taken a bit further because it's so close to being amazing. If the series is about anything, it's about ending things. The season concludes in about the most melancholy way that it possibly could have. Barry is arrested, Fuchs is in prison, Sally returns to Missouri. Gross. But if you thought it was going to end any other way, you clearly haven't been paying attention. I honestly have no idea how the writers are going to dig themselves out of the massive fucking crater that the finale left behind. It's easily the most open-ended final episode thus far, and the fact that it split up the cast isn't doing itself any favors. But if this latest season has taught me anything, it's that I should trust these writers. While this latest batch of episodes might not be the flashiest thing ever, it's no doubt something that will stick with you, and if I had to put into words why comedic dramas are so universally acclaimed, I would probably say it's because they're the full package. They can make you laugh, they can make you cry, they can make you think, or at times they can just be something to turn your brain off to. And realizing this helped me understand season 3 of Barry and its many changes to its own structure. Because if the series is about anything, it's about comedy, and how the world will keep on laughing long after you stop.
Oh my god, is that seriously how I'm ending it? Oh my, that's so fucking cringy. Jesus Christ.